And I'm Sandra Lubarsky, and I'm actually president of Flagstaff College. The 3.5% project is sponsored by Flagstaff College in Flagstaff, Arizona. And our mission is to provide education that is genuinely community-based and focused on the most pressing problems that are facing us as a civilization and as a community, in order that we could respond in ways that are creative, thoughtful, and democratic. We're happy also to have the support of the Center for Process Studies, which is in Oregon, and they promote planetary flourishing based on a process relational understanding of reality. It's a worldview that we share with the center. This round of the 3.5% project focuses on the intersection of economics and, on the climate disaster and disastrous forms of capitalism. As the renowned economist David Korton, our guest tonight, has said, quote, "Making the growth of monetary exchange and financial assets the defining purpose of society is an act of collective insanity." The 3.5% project gets its name from the idea that serious change can happen when 3.5% of the population is involved in making it happen. So even in the face of numerous disastrous conditions, if we come together, we can turn the tide. David Korton has been advocating for turning the tide for decades. Marcus Ford, who's co-founder of Flagstaff College, gets the honor of introducing him.
So with that, let me say that David Korton is one of those rare individuals who's capable of questioning at a very deep level what everyone knows to be true. Everyone knows, for example, that there's no alternative to economic globalism and that multinational corporations are making the world better for all of us. Everyone knows that it's essential to grow the GDP and that with enough money, we can save the environment and make more money in the process. Everyone knows these things, even though they aren't true. David has a long and distinguished career both inside and outside our great institutions of learning. He's been a professor at the Harvard Business School and at Harvard School of Public Health. He's been a development officer for the Ford Foundation in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. He's an active member of the Club of Rome and the author of many books, including perhaps his best-known book, When Corporations Rule the World. And he is the founder and president of the Living Economies Forum, and along with his wife, Fran Korton, the founder of Yes Magazine. There's a tendency to think that we can address the climate crisis within the economic model that we have, and that we must solve it within that because there's no viable alternative to our current economic model. David Korton reminds us that there really are good reasons, in addition to the ecological crisis, to move quickly away from our current economic system, and that there are viable alternatives. David, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us tonight.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. The basic frame that I work from is starting out with a very clear recognition that we humans are currently on a path to destroying Earth's capacity to sustain life as we know it, which means that it is, in fact, a path to self-extinction. And anybody that doesn't recognize that human self-extinction is a serious problem is probably not paying proper attention. Now, the other piece that we get less attention to is that we have the potential as a species to achieve dramatic and rapid change. But we rarely discuss the depth that that change requires. And as I think even about the 3.5% framing, I like that frame that a few of us can change the world, but I also find myself rather doubtful, given the depth of the changes we have to navigate. Because that frame is based on an assumption that the changes that are necessary, that if we achieve them, a vast proportion of the population will not even recognize that anything has happened. And at least by my sense of the depth of the changes, which will require a fundamental civilizational transformation, even to the extent of coming to be aware that what we have referred to as civilization for a very long time is not really civilized. And that in a sense, the challenge before us is to create a civilization that is truly civilized, and civilized in terms of care for life and care for one another. And it's definitely not this dream of, oh, we'll all have unlimited consumption and well-being, and we won't have to work, and oh, it's just going to be so cool. It's a whole different way of looking at what it means to be human, a different way of looking at what it means to be alive, and the nature of life, and the purpose of life, and even of creation itself. But anyhow, in terms of starting out, I'd be very interested in hearing any of you want to share. We don't have time for long, but at least in one or two sentences, how you see the current human situation and our possibilities. Any, just to help me get a sense of where we're at as a group. Any of you feel inclined to, I don't know if you can raise your hand, in the reactions, you click reactions down at the bottom and raise your hand, or if you're on video, just raise your hand.
I see Vicky Skelzer. Go ahead.
I'd see it as unsustainable. What we're doing now is unsustainable. Mm-hmm. And the values are just ones that I don't resonate with them, and I think they need to change. Somehow it's really shifted towards money and stuff in a way that in a way that's really disturbing. I'm 70, so that kind of gives you my trajectory through life, and I'm very interested in hearing the other perspectives on it, reading a lot about it. Found this 3.5% group to be interesting in terms of places to get new ideas about it. I'm not sure how to bring it to fruition. So,
right. Well, I just tell you quickly. I mean, in my view, anybody that thinks they know how to bring it to fruition doesn't understand the serious problem. But that's part of the challenge. We're only going to do this together and learning together. And that's why this particular exercise you're involved in here is so important. Anyone else?
Gary, go ahead. Gary, you're.
Yes, yeah. Now, I agree with you, Professor, in terms of carrying capacity. This goes back to my undergraduate days of ecology and carrying capacities of any system, whatever that system be. And I look at it, in terms of live biological systems, but that's true of Earth and Mother Earth. And I'm also concerned about power and economic power and the control of power and concentration of power at times, and how that can be. At this point, I think it's weighed more in terms of the control is not as democratic as I think it absolutely needs to be. So,
yeah. I mean,
those
that's
are my
one of the things
thoughts.
I've come to recognize, that at least here in the United States, we've never really been a democracy. It's still a dream. That's part of the rethinking and part of what's necessary in the deep transformation. We'll get a little further into that. Anyone else?
Let's see, Bob Brunig, you're raise your hand, and then Mark Sorensen.
I guess I have to say, I'm pretty discouraged. I I feel that we're not really taking this problem seriously enough. I hear a lot of talk. I hear a lot of pronouncements, but I don't really see the level of action and the level of movement that is going to be required to save this planet in time.
Yeah. I am in total agreement. Okay, maybe this is time to move on and
David, how about we take one more comment from Mark Sorensen, who's done a lot of really amazing work in the community.
oh, good.
Yeah, I'd like to say that one of the things about Arizona is we have 22 tribes in the state, and and a number of the tribes are still maintaining their cultural roots and their cultural strength. And one of the things that brings to mind to me in terms of your question is the idea that there needs to be a change of heart, that that until our society can grasp that the earth is a living being and we have a relationship with it, then so many things are just going to be window dressing, whatever we do. So, and whether people are willing to perceive that or not, I don't think can be forced. I think people are going to have the experience. And it occurs to me that sometimes when nature does drastic things, that's when we realize through hurricanes or volcanoes or whatever, the power of the earth that we live on and that we are on a living being.
Very, very important. And I think, I don't know, I don't quite grasp the whole thing, but I sense that something is happening in terms of our interest in learning from indigenous wisdom and indigenous understanding. I, in fact, just got a message today from one of my longest time colleagues who lives in Costa Rica and who just participated in the meeting of the Club of Rome in Costa Rica over the last 2 days. And he said it was one of the most extraordinary experiences he's ever had. And when he explained why, he said there's a very strong participation from the Latin American indigenous people. And their contributions were just apparently breathtaking in terms of the sense of the insight that contributed to that conversation, which I gather was a conversation exactly about the deep transformation we now need to navigate. And part of what I want to draw attention to in the presentation is the very interesting ways in which I see that we're getting a convergence between the deepest of indigenous wisdom and current scientific understanding. The scientific understanding allows us to go deeper into more detail and deeper understanding because of the instruments that we have available to make observations that indigenous people simply were not able to do because they didn't have the technology. But the convergence between that indigenous wisdom and our most advanced understanding, I find truly extraordinary. So anyhow, to move forward, I mean, just, you know, you've already mentioned these things, but just in terms of the, you know, the basic stats, as I suspect that most all of you know, that are familiar with the Global Footprint Network and the basic statistic that it would take 1.7 Earths to sustain current levels of human consumption. That's all key, the living Earth, the regenerative systems of the Earth, and what they can sustain. Now, we only have one Earth, so we're consuming essentially at, I'm not sure the statistic, but something like we're consuming at a somewhat 70% rate higher than what Earth can sustain. So what we're doing is making up the difference by consuming in ways that destroy Earth's capacity to regenerate, which is actively suicidal. Now, there's so many things we need to rethink, but one of them will need to be, what are the things we could give up in terms of our consumption that would leave us better off if we stopped consuming them? You know, these are the places where there's obvious room for cutback. And I'm sure you could all identify many of them if we had the time to open it up. But, you know, a first place to start would be war. Just imagine the incredible destruction and loss in Ukraine as a current example. It is totally pointless, to no purpose whatever. And then, of course, there are all the preparations for war, even if we don't use them. But that's kind of a leading example. But other things we could give up: financial speculation and Bitcoin, all the various aspects of planned obsolescence, our dependence on cars, our extraordinary overdependence on single-person households, which is also unique to our particular point in time. Or how about giving up extreme inequality? I'm struck that on January 17th of this year, Oxfam International reported that the wealth of the world's 10 richest billionaires, that's two hands worth, 10 richest billionaires, their fortunes had doubled since just the beginning of the pandemic. So while pretty much everybody else on Earth is being pushed down into ever greater desperation, these richest billionaires doubled their fortunes. The incomes of 99% of the world's people have fallen. The wealth of those 10 billionaires is now greater than the wealth of the bottom 40% of humanity. That would be 3.1 billion people of the same wealth as those 10 billionaires. Now, it's not surprising with this dynamic playing out that we're experiencing a massive loss of institutional credibility as we move forward on the pathway to social and environmental breakdown and human self-extinction. Now, we can also take this as a sign of hope. It's a bit of a stretch, but can you put up now my my great turning emblem? This little figure here, to me, kind of captures our time. That we have this curve at the top, which represents the dying of the old. In a sense, the dying of what we have called civilization, but which I would characterize as an imperial civilization, because it was based on organization from the top down and the exploitation that goes with it, exploitation of both people and earth. Whereas we are seeing the beginnings of the birthing of the new, on which our future depends. And that is our hope. Now, if many of you feel discouraged, I can assure you that I share your discouragement. I face that every day because by any logical analysis, we are too late and the changes required are too big. And yet part of what those of our generation have experienced is reason to give us cause for hope. As I mentioned, I'm 85. I don't, that may make me the oldest member of the group. I don't know, but I'm sure others of you are old enough to recall back in our youth that our most powerful mode of communication with people outside our immediate community was snail mail. And a number of you may have had the same experiences that I did of living overseas during a time when snail mail was our only communication with back home. And of course, now, what we're experiencing right now, I mean, most of us, I think, on this call are in the United States, but the technology would allow us to bring in people from anywhere on Earth. Now, it's hard to get our minds around the extraordinary implications of this. That we have the means now to make decisions as a species, to understand ourselves as a global species in ways that have never been possible for humans in the past. And that is a huge cause for hope. But we have so much to learn about what that means in terms of the transformation of our institutions. But when we ask the question, why are we in such deep trouble? There is basically a very simple answer. We're in deep trouble because we have forgotten an obvious but profound truth. Our South African ancestors called it Ubuntu, which translates, and of course, I'm sure all of you on this recognize that we all ultimately came, at least from the best of our scientific understanding, came from Africa. That's where the human species originated. These are our deepest ancestors. Ubuntu translates, I am because you are. I exist because you exist. Now that may seem a little woo-woo, but as we get into our deeper scientific understanding, it is an absolute truth of extraordinary significance. And science is beginning to give us an understanding of that that goes way, way beyond that indigenous understanding. Now, when Dr. Ford when we first talked about this session, he suggested that I share a bit of my personal history as part of the background. He's talked about my credentials, the degrees and all that kind of stuff. But in some ways, the more interesting part are the segments of my life history, which may be parallel to some of your own. I grew up in a small town in Washington State, northwest of the United States. I grew up very close to nature. I spent a lot of time out in nature and hiking and camping out and so forth. And my family was a mercantile family. We had a music and appliance store. It was quite successful. It was one of the larger stores in the community, but it was a small business, and it was a family business. And I grew up assuming that that would be my life. Everybody in my family assumed that. I was the eldest son, so that I was the natural one to take over. But then there was a dramatic shift in my life. In my senior year at Stanford, where I'd gone to get my college preparation to run the family business, I was a very conservative young Republican at the time, and I was very concerned about those communist revolutions that were threatening our American way of life. In my senior year, they had a thing called a senior colloquium, and one of them was on modern revolution. I thought, well, I've got to take this silly course that has nothing to do with going back to business. Maybe I'll take that one and see, learn something about these revolutions. And in that course, I learned that those revolutions were born of the frustrations of poverty. And that had one of the dramatic impacts on my life. I decided right there and then, I was already headed for business school to further my preparation to get a master's in business. I said, I'm going to go ahead and go to business school, but my purpose will not be the family business. It will be to go out into the world and bring the secrets of US business success to the world's poor people in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. That led to my next 30 years working as a member of the establishment institutions in business education, but gradually getting more and more engaged in the issues that people were facing in their rural lives, and the farming and the forestry and the control of land and water resources and the management of those resources to actually meet human needs. And in the course of that, I came to realize that what we were promoting in the name of economic development based on conventional economics to lift people out of poverty was actually pushing people off of the land. It was destroying their communities. It was destroying their cultures. It was turning them into landless migrant agricultural workers and sweatshop employees, all working to make money for people who were already far richer than they were or would ever be. That work led me to 21 years of literally living, first in Africa, then in Latin America, and then in Asia, during which time I became exposed to the extraordinary diversity of the world's cultures, what it means to be truly human, the wonderful, wondrous beauty of the desire of most of the world's people to be helpful to another, to care for Earth and to care for one another, to recognize that that is one of our deepest and most distinguished human traits. And of course, totally opposite to the assumption on which all our economic theory is based. Wow. Are we an intelligent species? Or are we fucking idiots? I see some of you laughing. Yes, I mean, what can we do but laugh? one of the things I want to talk about is, many of us have our fancy academic degrees. Many of the most important educational experiences of my life were things that happened totally outside of academia. Sometimes just a single conversation. And one of those conversations, after I had begun to grasp what was really going on in terms of so-called economic development, I was happened to be meeting with one of my close friends and colleagues who was a leading Indian intellectual of the time, Smita Kothari. And Smita said to me, he says, David, we know you came over here to help us. He says, we think you're beginning to learn what our real problem is. He says, if you really want to be helpful to us, you need to go back home to the United States and teach there what you have learned abroad. And I realized he was exactly right. That I'd gone abroad to teach, but the most important part of my experience was what I learned. And it did come home. And my life since has been engaging over the past 30 years with many of the world's leading global thought leaders and civil society activists, dedicated to helping the human species find its way to a truly civilization. So writing best-selling books and giving lectures and doing what we're doing right now on Zoom, as well as in-person conferences. But I want to share with you one of the other kind of momentary experiences in my life, which has pretty much changed my whole approach to everything that I've done. I mean, I was beginning to understand in much greater depth, the institutional causes of our crisis. And of course, my field in business school was business organization. So that was very helpful in understanding how the ways we structure our businesses, in particular our transnational corporations, focus them on maximizing profits while ignoring every other aspect of life and the sources of our well-being. But the real breakthrough in terms of understanding the alternatives and where we need to go was back in 1997. I was at an international conference in Santiago de Compostela, Spain. And in between sessions, this woman walked up to me and introduced herself. She says, I'm Dr. Mei Wan Ho, clearly of Chinese extraction. She says, I know your work. She says, I'm a microbiologist, actually a new biologist. And I think what I'm doing may be relevant to what you are doing. Well, that's interesting. She gave me a very quick introduction. And then, I don't know, it's like Providence was at work. It turned out that when we were flying back to London, we were both flying to London from this conference, it turned out we were on the same plane and we were able to arrange to sit by each other. She gave me the most extraordinary instruction I've ever had in my life. And by the time I got on my plane and flew from London to New York City, I had outlined one of my books that became an international bestseller, but has also changed, had a ultimate impact on everything I've done. So the question, what's a new biologist? You're a new biologist. She says, well, she says a conventional biologist takes a living cell, grinds it up, studies its chemical composition, and thinks they've learned something about life. In other words, to study a living cell, you first kill it. Well, that sounds pretty smart, doesn't it? She says, I study living cells and how they engage in the constant exchange of nutrients, water, energy, and information. Wow. Can I verify that in some science book? Well, that's a ridiculous question. I mean, it's one of these things that's so amazing to me that when it's pointed out, it is a breakthrough recognition that is obvious. And yet it's totally beyond our normal awareness. Anyhow, she then proceeds to explain the implications. Take each of our bodies, each of our physical bodies is comprised of tens of trillions of individual living cells engaged in this constant exchange. Roughly half of those cells are an integral part of the structure of the body, our skin and our bones and flesh. An roughly equal number are the microbes and viruses and all the individual cells that are floating around in our bloodstreams and in our intestines and so forth. And we may think of them as infectious and so forth, but most all of them are absolutely essential to our ultimate function. Isn't that interesting? So what does this tell us? I exist because all of you are. Wow. Tens of trillions of you. And there is no central control point. Yeah, we have our brain and that helps us out and allows us to move around and make intelligent choices and all sorts of things. But the basic mechanisms that keep our body, that create and maintain this vessel of our consciousness and vehicle of our agency, those are all self-organizing. Individual beings somehow collaborating together to create and maintain this vessel. I don't know about you, but that just blew my fucking mind. You know, and my field is organization. How is that possible? Clearly it's impossible. And yet every one of our bodies does it. Oh, maybe we should pay attention. Then we go to the next stage. Science looking at this planet Earth. Planet Earth, yeah, well, that's kind of interesting. We call it a living Earth, yeah. Now, of course, if you follow astronomy, you know that astronomers now identify an absolutely endless number of galaxies, not just planets, but galaxies in the cosmos. Wow. Any idea how many trillions of planets there must be? We're a long way from identifying all of them, and even further away from knowing exactly what their surface conditions are. But the one thing we do know is that we have yet to identify a planet where we have enough information to have reason to believe that it has surface conditions on it similar to those of Earth, or at least the surface conditions on which we could exist. You know, we got these billionaires building their spaceships to go out, and they're going to get off of this Earth and they're going to go someplace else. Well, I wish them great luck. Yeah. Be sure you take all your oxygen, water, and food with you. If you don't take the food, take the soils with you, et cetera, et cetera. This planet is very distinctive in the cosmos. Why is it distinctive? Well, the only rational explanation I've ever come up with is that this planet is distinctive because life on this planet created that distinction. That life on Earth creates and maintains the conditions on Earth that are essential to the existence of life as we know it, which is an analogy to the cells in our body. That this begins to tell us about the nature of life, that life exists, at least advanced life exists only in living communities of diverse organisms that self-organize to create and maintain the conditions of their own existence. Now, what does that tell us? That tells us that our challenge is to learn to do the same. Wow. We've got a lot of learning to do. And of course, everything that we're taught in economics stands in our way. Because we organize as a now global interdependent species based on the formula, the models of an economics that values life only for its market price. It assumes that things have value only if you can sell them. But of course, the things of real value are priceless. There is no price at which we should be willing to give up stable climates, drinkable water, fertile soils, and on and on and on. But if we look at conventional economics, which I call egonomics, the economics of the self, the economics of money, it makes a societal goal growing money, GDP. And the individual goal is to compete for money, wages and investment returns. At least wages is for doing presumably useful work. Investment returns are basically nothing. And we rarely ask, what is money? Well, there's some money. It's a piece of paper with a number on it. And maybe I got a credit card, you know, that'll give me, I put it in a computer and, well, there's a big bucket of money in my computer here someplace. Would you ever imagine arriving on a desert island with maybe a big chest full of gold coins? Well, that's cool. What are you going to eat? What are you going to drink? Where are you going to sleep? Those gold coins are as worthless as this crap is worthless in terms of actual living. And yet we can't live without this because of the way we've designed society. If you don't have this, if you don't have a little of that money, the way we've structured society, you will have no food, you will have no water, you will have no place to live. Oh, wow, I guess it must be worth something. But what we have to recognize is that money is a tool, it is not a purpose. It's a sometimes useful tool, but it is not a purpose. Now, I'm going to sum up a few of the other key points here, and then we go to our discussion. Our challenge is to learn to manage our relationships with one another and Earth, our collective relationships, in ways that maintain the health and vitality of Earth as a living being with the regenerative systems by which it continuously regenerates and renews. And the problem, I don't know, actually, given the age here, I assume I may not be the only person who's ever flown an airplane. Have you ever flown an airplane? You know, it's actually kind of complicated. But here, think about flying an airplane in relation to managing an economy. The economy we manage essentially against one indicator, the GDP. And our focus is on the speed of growth of that indicator. Now, I liken that to flying an airplane on a dark night in a rainstorm. You can't see a thing, with only an airspeed indicator and an urge to get home as fast as you can. So you say, okay, I got the airspeed indicator. We're going to go as fast as we can in this dark night. What will you do and what will happen? Well, it's a simple answer. You probably don't need to be a trained pilot to figure it out. You push the stick forward, you go into a steep dive, and pretty soon you crash and you're home on Earth very fast and you're dead. Managing the economy against an airspeed indicator is the same kind of stupidity. Now, if you've got that other image, which comes from Donut Economics and Kate Raworth. I'm not sure that I'm totally taken with the specific indicators she uses, but the overall framework is extraordinarily powerful. Essentially, the key here, I assume most of you have seen this before. There are two circles. There's the environmental ceiling and there is the social foundation. And what that gives you is two sets of indicators. You know, like in an airplane, you've got to have altitude, you've got to have airspeed, you've got to have direction, and a whole bunch of other indicators to maintain your flyability and go in the right direction. The social foundation, this is what does the economy need to provide for every individual, every person on Earth? All of the essential needs of food and water, a place to live, healthcare, education, energy, etc. At the same time, we are dependent on a living Earth. And we've got limits on how much pressure we can put on Earth. And we also bear the responsibility of caring for Earth to maintain Earth's ability to maintain climate stability, to continuously regenerate fresh water, to continuously restore the fertility of the soils and all the other aspects of Earth's living viability. In between the space of a viable living Earth and the meeting of our essential requirements as living beings is the safe and just space for humanity. And we have to manage this space to meet our needs in ways that maintain the health of Earth. And it's kind of like having an airplane with adequate panels. But this, this to me is the challenge that we face of what are the indicators that work for managing our individual communities, for managing our global institutions and so forth, to maintain this safe and just space in between, which allows us to figure out how we live to meet our own needs.
David, it's 7:30. Maybe that's a good place to leave it and
Yeah.
open up to questions.
Well, let me just
Sure.
quickly touch on a couple of other things, but I'll do that very quickly. One of the things that is essential here is recognizing that life organizes from the bottom up. That's in our bodies. The cells are organizing from the bottom up. If we look at how Earth organizes, every place on Earth is organizing in different ways. The conditions are different. The needs are different. The species are different. And so there's no overall model. There has to be this constant organization, and that becomes essentially a model for humanity, that our central institutions need to be structured not to control and dictate to the local, but rather what we call subsidiarity, support the local in controlling its own resources, controlling its own relationships in order to maintain the conditions of local viability, which has implications for all of our institutions, for government, for business, for education, for religion, for how we think about science and organize science. All elements of the rethinking that are essential to our move to an ecological civilization, a global civilization of self-reliant, self-organizing local communities, sharing information, learning, and surplus as we create a world of material sufficiency and spiritual abundance for all. So I will close with that and throw it back to you.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Let me ask you some questions, and then we'll have other people ask questions.
I'm also looking for other people's comments and insights. So it's not just one way.
Great. We've so institutionalized this economic model in our higher education, lower education, in our public sphere, and we've passed all these laws, international treaties that codify this kind of free market capitalism that has made protectionism a dirty word, that protecting our communities, protecting our jobs, protecting our way of life, all that is somehow seen as a kind of evil. How do we start to break out of these treaties and agreements that we've signed on to?
By recognizing that they are killing us. I mean, it's partly, it goes deeper that we currently organize as a global species. Our centers of power are these transnational corporations. And even the language that we use is misleading. Oh, a multinational corporation. That suggests a corporation that is local everywhere. Well, that's nice. The truth is they are transnational corporations. They don't give a damn about any place on earth unless they, can extract profit out of it, but they have no concern for the well-being of anything except financial returns to their shareholders. And of course, if you organize a society around shareholders, I mean, this is a characteristic. Why are we moving towards such inequality? Because we've got a few people who have extra financial assets and they expect to get continuous returns on those assets. And the assets of the billionaires keep compounding. Everybody else is in constant debt. Instead of getting extra returns, they are giving out more and more and more in interest on their debts. So you get this spread between the interest receivers and the interest payers. And that's a key factor of what drives this inequality that we started out talking with. Now, these are the fundamental things that we need to communicate, that the only people who should that love that system and beholden to it are these few billionaires. But there's billions of us that have a common interest in getting beyond that system. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
And
David, I want to just read you, or have Adam Wasserman just posted, capitalism can't live with it, can't live without it. And Adam, do you want to go ahead and read your comment and ask your question directly?
Sure. What I wrote was, okay, capitalism can't live with it, can't live without it, at least for the moment.
right.
We have hard limits must meet set by physics and chemistry. We have a cultural and spiritual transformation, as you've been describing, fast enough to keep us from blowing by these limits? Or do we need, for the immediate future, to just put our foot on the neck of these corporations and financial institutions and make them work for our benefit?
Well, that's a very good question. In the paper that I urge people to write, Ecological Civilization from Emergency to Emergence, that emergency to emergence frame comes from the Club of Rome, at least in terms of my grasping of it. And in the Club of Rome, we've taken exactly the position you just outlined, that we cannot wait for the necessary deep changes. We have to act immediately. The science tells us by the end of this decade, we've got to start making significant changes. So that's the emergency. At least my sense is that we need to attack the emergency in the same way. And as you say, we just take hold of it and change it. But it needs to be with an understanding that of doing it in a way that leads us toward creating these deeper institutional transformations that maintain this system in a wholly new way. And I think about one of the key frames being, what is material sufficiency? Now, if we do that right, that's not about self-deprivation. Because if we recognize our spiritual side and the things that give us deep satisfaction in terms of the care for one another in earth, it actually can be a more fulfilling life at the same time that it's a less consumptive life. So those are kind of big elements of exactly what you're saying.
David, there's a question here from Mark Sorensen. You want to go ahead and ask it, Mark? And then I want to pull Eva in, who says we actually can live without capitalism. So, but Mark first and then Eva.
Yeah, thank you. Very thought-provoking. My question is, what do you think about getting business practices to adopt responsibility to the triple bottom line, people, place, and profit? Do you think we can rethink that much? And do you think it'll lead us in the right direction?
Yeah. One of the aspects of my experience, when I grew up in this business family, one of my dad's standard slogans was, if you're not in business to serve your customer, you have no business of being in business. Now, his customers were clearly the community in which we lived. Now, this is one of the other interesting aspects of my life. When I was on the faculty of the Harvard Business School, it turned out that that was in a defining moment in US business history. That following World War II, many of our largest corporations, certainly not all of them, but many of them were operating on a philosophy that they were multi-stakeholder institutions. In other words, they existed to serve their customers, to serve their owners, to conserve their workers, to serve the communities. And the most prestigious members of the Harvard Business School faculty were the big thinkers who thought about business and society in exactly those terms. During the time I was there, and I experienced this, younger faculty coming in that had been studying this god-awful excuse for economics, that it's all about money and profits and business exists only to maximize profits, they were actually beginning to take over the intellectual life of the business school and to transform the culture. And that's one reason I decided to leave there. It was clearly a mutual decision, but clearly it was not a place where I could pursue the life that I wanted to pursue. Now, what's significant about that now, and part of what we need to understand, as long as you have corporations that are publicly traded in today's global financial markets, where the shares are running back and forth, they're all being traded in markets. People, we call them investors, but they're actually speculators. You're not investing when you're buying shares in a publicly traded transnational corporation. You're in a gambling casino, and you're hoping if I bet on this, I'll get more money than if I bet on that, and that one's going to lose, and so forth. But it has nothing to do whatever with meeting the needs of any people or community, or contributing anything to the well-being of life. The key here is ownership. My dad's business was owned by my dad, who was a member of that community. And it's fascinating. If you read Adam Smith, who is the kind of the ultimate founder of modern economics, as we look to him as such, and you read not only his Wealth of Nations, but also his theory of moral sense.
Take it somewhere else.
Well, you were speaking.
You want to listen now.
Oops, everyone mute yourself, please, everyone.
Adam Smith was actually very clear that the reason the business person cares is he's a member of the community, and he cares about his neighbors. And that influences how he makes his decisions. Now, this is an interesting thing about, if we think of our only choices are capitalism and socialism, we're in Never Never Land. Capitalism assumes that the assets are all owned. I mean, contemporary capitalism. And Adam Smith, by the way, was not a capitalist. He never used the term capitalism because the term did not exist at his time when he was writing. But the capitalism we know is a concentration of wealth at a global level in massive pools devoted to, a transnational corporation is not a group of people. They have no rights, whatever. It is the money that has the rights. It's the pool of money. They are pools of money, legally protected pools of money that are managed to grow. And if you're a manager and you're not doing your job growing that pool of money, you will be replaced. Unless, of course, you have engineered things so that you also own all of those shares, then you're in pretty fat shape. But the way we need to think about this, the alternative that we need is not socialism, which means that government, centralized government owns everything, and the bureaucrats have all the ultimate power. But what we need are essentially worker and community cooperatively owned and managed businesses. Probably much smaller than the largest businesses today, so they actually fit with the communities they serve, but that are owned by people who live next door to each other and ultimately care about each other and ultimately recognize that I am because you are. We call it the Ubuntu principle. Wow.
David, can I ask you quickly? We've got a couple comments here from Peggy Collins. And Peggy, you want to raise the issue that you're raising regarding charters?
Well, I had read years ago that corporations started, when they started, they had to have a charter. They were local, and that if they didn't serve the community in which they lived, their charter was not renewed the next year.
Yep.
I think that would work. It could work for transnational corporations, which would still be required to serve the communities that they live in.
In theory. But of course, when you get that kind of concentrated power, it's the question of who's going to control them. And of course, here in the United States, we've got our Supreme Court, which has been controlled and manipulated by the richest among us, and it is to this day. They've given the corporation more and more rights, which means that people have fewer and fewer rights. Now, my sense is that we should recognize that the publicly traded, limited liability transnational corporation is an illegitimate institution by its very nature and should be abolished. Now, what exactly are the acceptable limits and the acceptable structures? I think we've got a long way to go in terms of learning what the limits are on that. But the basic principle is that they should be too small to have monopoly power. If that's, some things are natural monopolies like power grids and so forth. But ideally, they should be worker or community owned. And this also, of course, is assuming a society of radical equality. I mean, to me, the two absolute fundamentals of an economy and an ecological civilization is that it's got to fit with that donut. It's got to it's got to maintain the health of the living earth. Well, it meets the needs of everyone, but it also has to be radical equality in terms of not just the distribution of income. That's not necessarily exactly equal, but ownership is the most important thing to be equitably distributed. And the kind of conceptual ideal is that everyone owns the means of creating their own livelihood. That's a little hard to apply universally, but that's kind of the conceptual part of it.
Eva, do you want in on this? Do you have a question or comment?
Well, I guess I think we're using these terms the way the political system kind of weaponized them. And, socialism doesn't necessarily mean the ownership of the state. It can be ownership of a community, and communities can have different size. But I'm just curious, and also I like to say that, we cannot live with capitalism. I guess my comment was like, not only plenty of people lived without capitalism, but also live today. We can argue about, deficiencies of the political arrangement and all that, but I think that's, that there always will be deficiencies, right? When humans are involved in implementing some theories or visions, making them real. But my maybe question is, David, what do you think? And I'm sure you're familiar with Michael Albert and Robin Hahnel's kind of vision for participatory economy, where you have these worker councils and you have consumer councils, and kind of envisions a different way of, I guess, ownership and decision making. And it's about more of a self-management, like a democratic way to decide, how much, what we're going to produce, and the need of people is considered primary.
Yeah, there are many positive examples. I would come back and say that we get locked into this trap of capitalism versus socialism, and what that really means to most people is either the private billionaires own everything, or the government owns everything, and both of those are traps. What we're talking about is perhaps best described as some form of communitarianism, which takes potentially many different forms that we're just beginning to discover. One of the models that I find most fascinating is Mondragon in Spain, which is probably the world's largest cooperatively owned collection of business enterprises, and has an extraordinary special relationship with government, and the whole structure of that society seems to create a very democratic process that is very responsive to the needs of its people. But these are exactly the questions that we have to be asking. But I would maintain that holding into the trap that our choices are between capitalism and socialism is deadly. We've got to get beyond that. It's the same thing. Well, these issues of language. Even our term capital is a problem, because capital includes real capital, land and labor and all of that, along with money as capital. Now, all other forms of capital have intrinsic value. Money itself has no intrinsic value. It is purely a mechanism, a tool. And as soon as you call money capital, then you're saying, oh, wow, that's really valuable, and we've got to manage our capital. Anyhow, these are just, just trying. There are so many traps, both linguistic and conceptual, that we've got to find ways to break ourselves out of.
Oh, David, let me just, once again, thank you for all these, for this presentation, but for all the work you've been doing over the years. And, you know, people can Google David or go to his website and see in more detail his work. Again, David, thank you so much for speaking with us. And thanks to everyone who Zoomed in with us. We'll see you in December, later in
For the
December.
opportunity.
Thank you again. It was really wonderful to hear your really wise words and your wise narrative on all of this. Much appreciated. Good
Thank
night, everyone.